At its greatest extent, the British Empire controlled or administered roughly a quarter of the world's land and governed close to a quarter of its population. Its territories stretched across every inhabited continent. Its ships operated on every major ocean, and its leaders could famously claim that somewhere in the empire, the sun was always shining. Looking backward from that enormous map, Britain's rise can appear almost inevitable. It was anything but inevitable. In the late 15th century, England was not the world's dominant naval power. It was a relatively small European kingdom emerging from decades of dynastic conflict, while Portugal and Spain were already leading the great maritime expansion beyond Europe. Portuguese navigators were developing routes around Africa toward Asia. Spain would soon establish an enormous American empire. England arrived late, possessed fewer resources, and had no master plan for global domination. The empire that eventually emerged was assembled gradually through trade, settlement, warfare, private companies, slavery, diplomacy, technology, and repeated moments of opportunity. Its story begins with a merchant voyage. In 1497, during the reign of Henry VII, the Venetian navigator John Cabot sailed west from Bristol aboard the Matthew. Cabot hoped that crossing the North Atlantic would lead toward Asia. Instead, he reached somewhere along the northeastern coast of North America, probably Newfoundland or a nearby region. The exact location remains disputed. The voyage created no permanent colony. Cabot returned believing he had approached Asia, and England did not immediately follow his journey with conquest. Yet the expedition mattered. English fishermen and merchants increasingly became familiar with North Atlantic waters, and later generations could invoke Cabot's voyage when making English claims in North America. It also revealed a method that would repeatedly shape England's overseas expansion. The Crown could provide authorization, while merchants supplied much of the capital and accepted much of the danger. Private ambition and state power could reinforce one another. For most of the 16th century, England remained behind Spain and Portugal overseas. Henry VIII invested significantly in England's navy, dockyards, administration, and warships, but his principal concerns were European security rather than construction of a worldwide empire. His break with Rome in the 1530s nevertheless altered England's international position. Religious rivalry increasingly overlapped with strategic competition. By the reign of Elizabeth I, Protestant England faced the immense Catholic monarchy of Philip II of Spain. Spanish ships transported silver and other wealth from the Americas. English merchants wanted access to markets Spain attempted to reserve for itself. English sailors increasingly tested those restrictions. Some did so through trade. Others did so through violence. John Hawkins became involved in voyages trafficking enslaved Africans to the Americas during the 1560s. His expeditions represented an early English participation in a system that would later become deeply embedded in Britain's Atlantic economy. Francis Drake combined exploration, privateering, and attacks on Spanish possessions. Between 1577 and 1580, he completed a circumnavigation of the world while capturing Spanish wealth along the way. Spain regarded him as a pirate. Elizabeth regarded him as useful. She knighted him aboard the Golden Hind in 1581. This blurred boundary between private enterprise and national strategy became characteristic of English expansion. An adventurer could enrich himself while damaging a rival. A merchant company could advance English influence while paying its own expenses. The government could benefit without directly administering every enterprise. Then, in 1588, Philip II sent the Spanish Armada toward England as part of an attempted invasion. English naval resistance, Spanish operational and logistical problems, and severe weather all contributed to the Armada's failure. Later British mythology sometimes treated 1588 as the instant beginning of English naval supremacy. Spain remained a major power afterward, and England itself experienced serious military failures. But the Armada's defeat had enormous symbolic importance. England had survived a major invasion attempt. The sea increasingly looked like an opportunity rather than merely a defensive boundary. Writers such as Richard Hakluyt promoted overseas trade and colonization. Advocates argued that settlements could provide commodities, markets, strategic bases, employment, and a Protestant answer to Spanish power. The first English attempts in North America failed. Sir Humphrey Gilbert claimed Newfoundland in 1583, but died at sea during his return voyage. Walter Raleigh sponsored colonies on Roanoke Island. The settlement established there in 1587 had disappeared by the time a relief expedition returned in 1590. The mysterious word Croton remained carved at the abandoned settlement. The colonists' ultimate fate remains uncertain. Roanoke failed, but the idea survived. When Elizabeth died in 1603, England had no permanent colony in North America. It did, however, possess increasingly experienced sailors, ambitious merchants, chartered trading organizations, a growing naval tradition, and investors willing to gamble money on distant ventures. 3 years before Elizabeth's death, one organization had appeared whose eventual importance could scarcely have been imagined. On December 31st, 1600, Elizabeth granted a charter to the company later known simply as the East India Company. Its initial objective was commerce, particularly participation in the enormously valuable Asian spice trade. The company sent its first fleet in 1601. Its merchants entered an Indian Ocean world dominated not by Europeans, but by sophisticated Asian political and commercial systems. Early English factories were trading posts whose survival depended heavily upon agreements with local rulers. The East India Company did not begin as the government of India. It began as a group of merchants seeking profit. Meanwhile, James VI of Scotland had become James I of England in 1603. Under him, another attempt was made to establish a permanent English settlement in North America. In 1607, 3 ships carried settlers in a Chesapeake Bay and upper river they named for the king. They established Jamestown. The colony nearly died. Disease spread. Food ran short. The water supply was poor. Many colonists were unprepared for the labor required to maintain the settlement. Relations with the Powhatan people shifted between commerce, diplomacy, tension, and violence. John Smith became a famous leader of the settlement. His later story that Pocahontas saved him from execution entered legend, although historians debate his account and its interpretation. Pocahontas herself was the daughter of Wahunsenkaw, the paramount leader the English called Powhatan. Her real life was far more complicated than the romantic legend. She was later captured by the English, converted to Christianity, married the settler John Rolfe, traveled to England, and died there in 1617. Jamestown survived an especially catastrophic winter in 1609 and 1610, known as the Starving Time. Then one commodity changed its future: tobacco. John Rolfe cultivated tobacco that found enthusiastic European buyers. Fields expanded rapidly. The colony finally possessed a profitable export. Profit created demand for more land and more labor. That brought expanding English settlement into deeper conflict with indigenous peoples. Initially, much colonial labor came from indentured servants who worked for several years in return for transportation. But another system was developing. In 1619, Africans were brought to Virginia. Their early legal status was more complicated than the fully developed racial slavery of later decades. But colonial law gradually made African ancestry increasingly associated with permanent hereditary enslavement. In the same year, Virginia established the House of Burgesses, giving certain colonists limited representative government. The coincidence is revealing. Political participation expanded for some, while unfreedom expanded for others. That contradiction would follow British imperial history for centuries. Conflict with the Powhatan Confederacy intensified. Hundreds of settlers were killed during coordinated attacks in 1622, and English retaliation was severe. The Virginia Company was financially troubled. In 1624, its charter was revoked and Virginia became a royal colony. A private company had created the foothold. The crown inherited the colony. English settlements multiplied during the 17th century. Plymouth was founded in 1620. Massachusetts Bay followed. Maryland, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Carolina, Pennsylvania, and others developed under different arrangements. There was never one colonial blueprint. Religion motivated some settlers. Profit motivated others. Land drew many. Companies founded some territories. Proprietors controlled others. And the crown gradually increased its role. Even England's civil war in the 1640s did not halt the country's commercial ambitions. Under the Commonwealth, Parliament passed the Navigation Act of 1651, seeking to channel commerce through English shipping and weaken Dutch merchants who dominated much of Europe's carrying trade. Commercial rivalry helped produce the Anglo-Dutch Wars. After the monarchy was restored under Charles II in 1660, further navigation acts strengthened an imperial trading system. Certain colonial products were supposed to move through English-controlled channels. Trade, shipping, customs revenue, and naval power became increasingly connected. One important prize came in 1664 when English forces seized New Netherland. New Amsterdam became New York. England now possessed a more continuous chain of colonies along the North American Atlantic coast. But some of the greatest fortunes were being generated farther south. Barbados, and after its capture from Spain in 1655, Jamaica developed enormous sugar industries. Sugar generated extraordinary profits. It also demanded brutal quantities of labor. Planters increasingly relied upon enslaved Africans. The Royal African Company became a major English participant in West African commerce and the trafficking of enslaved people. British and other European merchants operated within complex African political networks, purchasing captives produced through warfare, kidnapping, judicial enslavement, and other systems. European demand, capital, shipping, and weapons helped enlarge this trade on a catastrophic scale. The Atlantic crossing, known as the Middle Passage, was horrific. Captives were confined in crowded ships. Disease spread rapidly. Violence was routine. Many died before reaching the Americas. Survivors were sold into societies where colonial laws increasingly defined enslaved Africans and their descendants as property. On Caribbean sugar plantations, conditions were often lethal. Work was exhausting and dangerous. Disease, and malnutrition were common. Some planters found it economically preferable to purchase additional captives rather than sustain the existing population. But enslaved people never stopped resisting. They preserved and transformed religious traditions, languages, music, foodways, families, and communities. Some escaped. Maroon communities in Jamaica and elsewhere created independent settlements and sometimes fought colonial authorities successfully for years. Others resisted through revolt, sabotage, flight, work slowdowns, and countless acts that rarely entered official imperial records. The profits flowed outward. Plantation owners became wealthy. Merchants financed ships. Insurers covered voyages. British refineries processed sugar. Shipyards built vessels. Consumers purchased tobacco and sweetened tea. Bristol, London, and later Liverpool became deeply connected to Atlantic commerce. Slavery was not the only foundation of Britain's economic rise, but it was an important part of the Atlantic economy that enriched numerous British individuals, ports, companies, and institutions. As England's commercial power grew, its political and financial system changed. James II policies and Catholicism alienated powerful Protestant opponents. In 1688, William of Orange, husband of James's daughter Mary, landed in England with an army. James fled. William III and Mary II eventually accepted the crown under a constitutional settlement that strengthened Parliament. The so-called Glorious Revolution was comparatively bloodless in England, but produced serious warfare in Ireland and Scotland. Its long-term importance extended far beyond dynastic politics. Parliament gained greater authority over taxation. Government borrowing became more credible. The Bank of England was founded in 1694. A national debt developed. Investors could lend to the state with greater confidence that taxes approved through Parliament would service government obligations. This helped produce a powerful fiscal military system. Taxes supported borrowing. Borrowing financed armies and fleets. Fleets protected trade. Commerce increased taxable wealth. Britain became exceptionally capable of financing prolonged warfare. But Britain itself did not yet exist as a unified state. England and Scotland had shared a monarch since 1603 while retaining separate parliaments. Scotland's disastrous Darien colonial venture in the 1690s contributed to an economic and political crisis. A combination of financial interests, security concerns, dynastic politics, and negotiation eventually produced the Acts of Union. In 1707, England and Scotland became the Kingdom of Great Britain. Scottish merchants gained access to English colonial markets, and Scots would subsequently play major roles as imperial merchants, soldiers, doctors, administrators, missionaries, and settlers. The expanding empire was becoming genuinely British. The War of the Spanish Succession had already drawn Britain into a major struggle against France. British forces under the Duke of Marlborough won important victories. Gibraltar was captured in 1704. At the peace settlement beginning with Utrecht in 1713, Britain retained Gibraltar, gained important North American concessions, and secured the Asiento Contract, giving British interests rights to supply enslaved Africans to Spanish America. Britain was becoming a leading maritime and commercial power, but France remained its great imperial competitor. That rivalry culminated during the 7 Years' War. The conflict began in North America before expanding into Europe and around the world. British and French ambitions collided in the Ohio Valley. In 1754, a young George Washington became involved in fighting against French forces. By 1756, Britain and France were formally at war in a conflict extending across Europe, North America, India, the Caribbean, West Africa, and the oceans. William Pitt the Elder focused British strategy on naval strength, colonial conquest, and financial support for Prussia on the European continent. After early failures, British victories accumulated. Louisbourg fell in 1758. In 1759, James Wolfe's army defeated the French under Louis-Joseph de Montcalm on the plains of Abraham outside Quebec. Both commanders were mortally wounded. Montreal surrendered the following year. French Canada was effectively lost. Meanwhile, events in India were creating an even greater transformation. The Mughal Empire had weakened, and regional powers competed for influence. European trading companies intervened in local rivalries. In 1757, Robert Clive led East India Company forces against Siraj-ud-Daulah, Nawab of Bengal, at Plassey. The victory depended heavily on conspiracy and the failure of important sections of the Nawab's army to fight. It was as much political coup as battlefield triumph. The consequences were enormous. The company gained decisive influence in Bengal. After the Battle of Buxar in 1764, it secured revenue collecting rights in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. The company had entered Asia to buy spices and textiles. Now a private corporation was collecting taxes from millions of people. The 7 Years' War ended in 1763 with Britain in an extraordinary position. France cedait Canada. British influence in India had expanded dramatically. The Royal Navy had demonstrated global reach. But victory had been expensive. Britain's national debt had soared. Ministers concluded that American colonists should contribute more toward imperial defense. Many colonists believed Parliament was violating established rights by taxing them without their consent. The Stamp Act of 1765 provoked fierce resistance. It was repealed, but the constitutional dispute remained. Further taxation, the presence of British troops, the Boston Massacre, the Tea Act, the Boston Tea Party, and Parliament's punitive response escalated the confrontation. What began as an argument about taxation became an argument about sovereignty. In April 1775, fighting began at Lexington and Concord. In 1776, the Continental Congress declared independence. Britain faced an enormous logistical problem. Its armies could capture cities, but struggled to extinguish resistance across vast territory. The population itself was divided. Loyalists supported Britain. Patriots supported independence. Indigenous nations made strategic choices based on their own interests and the threat colonial expansion posed to their lands. Then Britain's rivals intervened. After the American victory at Saratoga in 1777, France allied with the revolutionaries. Spain later entered the war against Britain. The conflict became global. Britain had to defend the Caribbean, Gibraltar, India, Atlantic shipping, and the home islands while continuing its campaign in North America. In 1781, British forces under Lord Cornwallis became trapped at Yorktown. American forces under George Washington and French troops under Rochambeau besieged them, while a French fleet under Admiral de Grasse prevented effective relief by sea. Cornwallis surrendered. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 recognized the independence of the United States. Britain had lost 13 important colonies. Many assumed imperial decline would follow. Instead, the empire changed direction. Britain retained Canada and valuable Caribbean possessions. Its navy remained powerful. Its financial system survived, and the East India Company was expanding its position in Asia. Losing America pushed Britain's imperial center of gravity eastward. The company nevertheless presented Britain with an unprecedented question. Could a corporation legitimately govern millions of people? Bengal suffered a devastating famine in 1769 and 1770. Drought and crop failure played central roles, while company revenue practices and administrative failures worsened the catastrophe. Millions probably died, though exact numbers remain uncertain. Reports of corruption and sudden fortunes made by company servants reached Britain. Parliament increasingly intervened. The Regulating Act of 1773 represented an early attempt to supervise company government. Warren Hastings became Governor General of Bengal and attempted to reorganize administration. His later impeachment in Britain reflected a much larger argument over empire. If Britain ruled distant populations, what obligations did it owe them? That question had no easy answer. At the same time, Britain was turning toward the Pacific. James Cook's voyages greatly expanded European knowledge of the region. In 1770, Cook charted Australia's eastern coast for Britain. Australia was not empty. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples had lived there for tens of thousands of years, possessing diverse societies, languages, traditions, and relationships with land. Nevertheless, after Britain lost access to its American destinations for convict transportation, Australia became attractive as both a penal settlement and a strategic foothold. The first fleet sailed under Arthur Phillip in 1787 and reached Australia in January 1788. Phillip rejected Botany Bay as unsuitable and established the settlement at Sydney Cove. The first years were harsh. Food was scarce. Harvests failed. The colony depended on distant supply ships. Convicts performed forced labor to construct infrastructure. Yet the settlement survived. As British occupation expanded, indigenous Australians suffered disease, dispossession, violence, and the destruction of traditional resources. British colonization proceeded without treaties recognizing continent-wide indigenous sovereignty. That would leave consequences lasting in a modern Australia. Before Australia developed into a major settler society, Britain confronted another existential struggle. The French Revolution began in 1789. War between Britain and revolutionary France followed in 1793. Eventually, Napoleon Bonaparte dominated France and much of continental Europe. For Britain, the wars lasted, with interruptions, until 1815. Britain could not consistently match France's land power in Europe. Instead, it relied heavily on naval power, finance, alliances, and global trade. The Royal Navy blockaded enemies and attacked colonies. British credit subsidized continental allies. The financial system built during the previous century showed its importance. Then came Trafalgar. On October 21st, 1805, Admiral Horatio Nelson attacked a combined French and Spanish fleet off Spain. The British won overwhelmingly. Nelson was killed during the battle. The victory ensured that Napoleon could not seriously contest British command of the oceans. He remained dominant on land for years, but Britain's maritime position became extraordinarily strong. Britain used the war to strengthen strategic holdings around global routes. The Cape of Good Hope, Ceylon, Malta, and other positions became important links. The East India Company defeated major Indian opponents, including Tipu Sultan of Mysore, who was killed at Seringapatam in 1799. Wars against the Maratha powers expanded British influence further. By the early 19th century, British supremacy over much of India had become increasingly clear. Napoleon finally fell after the catastrophic failure of his invasion of Russia and renewed European resistance. At Waterloo in June 1815, an Allied army under the Duke of Wellington and Prussian forces under Blücher defeated Napoleon's final return. Britain emerged from the wars with unmatched maritime strength. London was becoming the world's central financial marketplace. British industry was accelerating. The 19th century would later be associated with Pax Britannica. The phrase should not be mistaken for literal global peace. Britain fought many wars and repeatedly used coercion. What changed was that no rival navy consistently displaced British maritime supremacy for much of a century. That allowed commerce to expand behind the protection of naval power. Meanwhile, the Industrial Revolution was transforming Britain itself. Coal, steam power, mechanized textiles, iron, factories, canals, and railways changed production. Cities expanded rapidly. Industrialization created enormous wealth and severe social misery. It also transformed imperial strategy. Earlier, mercantilism had sought protected colonial markets. Industrial Britain increasingly wanted markets everywhere. British manufacturers could profit without formally annexing every customer, provided markets remained accessible and shipping routes secure. Informal influence could sometimes achieve what territorial conquest had once accomplished. Yet, Britain still depended heavily on products created through enslaved labor. Opposition to slavery was growing. Quakers, Granville Sharp, Thomas Clarkson, William Wilberforce Olaudah Equiano, and many others helped create a mass abolitionist movement. Campaigners gathered evidence, organized petitions, published accounts of slave ships, held meetings, and encouraged consumer boycotts. Enslaved people themselves played an indispensable role through resistance and rebellion. The Haitian Revolution demonstrated dramatically that enslaved populations could destroy a plantation regime. In 1807, Parliament abolished the British slave trade. Slavery itself remained legal in much of the empire. The Royal Navy increasingly deployed the West Africa Squadron to intercept slave ships, freeing many captives while British diplomacy pressured other countries to restrict the trade. This represented a profound change. Britain, once one of the world's largest slave trading powers, was now using naval force against the trade. But hundreds of thousands remained enslaved in British colonies. The campaign continued. The Baptist War in Jamaica in 1831 and 1832 added pressure. In 1833, Parliament passed the Slavery Abolition Act. Most enslaved people in British colonies were emancipated through a process that initially subjected many to compulsory apprenticeship. Slave owners received approximately £20 million in compensation. The enslaved received none for generations of forced labor. The apprenticeship system ended by 1838 in the British Caribbean. Emancipation was historic. It did not create racial or economic equality. Plantation interests searched for replacement workers, increasingly relying on indentured laborers from India and elsewhere. Indenture was not legally slavery, but workers could experience coercive contracts, harsh discipline, low wages, and severe restrictions. Britain increasingly incorporated abolition into its imperial identity. Politicians and missionaries argued that British influence could suppress slavery, spread Christianity, encourage commerce, and bring what Victorians called civilization. Some sincerely believed this humanitarian mission. But moral language also became a justification for intervention. The empire could claim that expansion benefited the people being subjected to it. Economic ideology was changing too. Britain repealed the Corn Laws in 1846 and increasingly embraced free trade. Yet one of the clearest demonstrations of the contradiction between free trade rhetoric and imperial power appeared in China. Britain purchased enormous quantities of Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain. Because China demanded substantial payment in silver, British merchants sought another commodity to reverse the trade imbalance. They found it in opium produced under British-controlled systems in India. Private merchants smuggled the drug into China. The Qing government considered addiction and the outflow of silver a national crisis. In 1839, Commissioner Lin Zexu confiscated and destroyed large quantities of opium. Britain responded with war. Industrial technology gave British forces a major advantage. The Treaty of Nanjing in 1842 opened additional Chinese ports, required payment of an indemnity, and ceded Hong Kong Island to Britain. Further treaties expanded foreign privileges. A second war during the 1850s produced additional concessions and eventually legalization of the opium trade. Britain claimed to defend commerce. It had used military force to open markets for a drug the Chinese government had attempted to suppress. Nothing exposed the darker side of Victorian free trade, imperialism, more clearly. Then India erupted. By 1857, the East India Company commanded vast territories and one of the world's largest armies, composed mostly of Indian soldiers known as sepoys. Grievances had accumulated. British annexation policies alienated princes. Land revenue systems disrupted established interests. Missionary activity and social reforms generated fears that the government intended to destroy Indian religions. British officers increasingly maintained racial distance from Indian soldiers. The immediate crisis centered on cartridges for the new Enfield rifle. Rumors held that they were greased with cow and pig fat, offending Hindu and Muslim religious beliefs. When sepoys at Meerut rebelled in May 1857, the uprising spread rapidly through parts of northern and central India. Rebels occupied Delhi and recognized the elderly Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar as a symbolic leader. Nana Sahib became prominent around Kanpur. Rani Lakshmibai of Jhansi became one of the most celebrated resistance leaders. At Lucknow, Delhi, Kanpur, and elsewhere, warfare became ferocious. The rebellion was not a unified national uprising encompassing all India. Many rulers remained neutral or supported Britain. Large numbers of Indian soldiers remained loyal. Different rebel groups possessed different objectives. But the scale of the crisis shocked Britain. Both rebels and British forces committed atrocities. British reprisals were often brutal and sometimes indiscriminate. By 1858, the principal rebellion had been defeated. The political consequences were permanent. The East India Company's rule ended. Under the Government of India Act of 1858, India passed under direct Crown authority. The British Raj had begun. Queen Victoria promised religious tolerance and respect for Indian princes. The army was reorganized. British officials became more cautious about interfering openly in religious matters. At the same time, racial separation hardened. British rule increasingly rested on the belief that Indians might be governed for their supposed benefit, but were not ready to govern alongside Britons as equals. Technology strengthened the Raj. Railways spread across India. Telegraphs allowed officials to communicate with unprecedented speed. Steamships shortened travel. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 dramatically reduced the journey between Britain and Asia. In 1875, Benjamin Disraeli's government purchased the Egyptian ruler's shares in the Canal Company, giving Britain an enormous financial and strategic stake in the route. The infrastructure transformed India. Railways enabled migration and commerce. They also transported troops and export commodities. Telegraphs accelerated information while strengthening centralized control. Modern technology was simultaneously an instrument of development and imperial power. It could not prevent catastrophe. Between 1876 and 1878, severe famine affected large parts of India. Drought was central, but colonial policies, market structures, limited relief, and commitment to fiscal restraint shaped the human outcome. Millions died. The ability to move information rapidly did not guarantee that government would intervene adequately. Elsewhere, Britain was developing a different imperial model. Canada gained increasing control over its domestic government. In 1867, several British North American colonies federated as the Dominion of Canada. Canada possessed its own parliament while remaining connected to the Crown and Empire. Railways expanded settlement westward. For settlers, this represented nation building. For many indigenous peoples, expansion brought land loss, broken or coercive treaty relationships, suppression of resistance, and later assimilation as policies, including residential schools. The same imperial system could produce self-government for settlers and intensified control for indigenous populations. Australia developed similarly. Gold discoveries accelerated growth. Convict transportation ended. Colonies gained representative institutions. European settlements spread inland. Aboriginal communities suffered dispossession, violence, disease, and forced removal. In 1901, 6 colonies federated as the Commonwealth of Australia. One of the new Parliament's early priorities was restricting non-European immigration through legislation forming the foundation of the White Australia policy. Self-government existed inside an imperial world still organized by racial assumptions. New Zealand followed a related path. The Treaty of Waitangi in 1840 had established a disputed framework between the British Crown and Maori chiefs. Different English and Maori versions carried important differences in meaning. Expanding settlement led to warfare and extensive Maori land loss. New Zealand acquired responsible government and later became a dominion in 1907. Across the settler empire, Britain increasingly allowed extensive autonomy to populations regarded as culturally and racially British while maintaining authoritarian control over millions elsewhere. Meanwhile, competition in Africa accelerated. Britain had long possessed coastal interests and strategic settlements, but during the late 19th century, European rivals began claiming enormous territories. France expanded. Germany entered colonial competition. Belgium's King Leopold II acquired personal control over the Congo Free State, where forced labor and mass violence eventually produced international scandal. The Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885 established rules affecting European competition in Africa without African representation. It did not literally draw every future border, but it helped formalize an extraordinary assumption. Europeans could determine African sovereignty without asking Africans. Britain expanded through companies, treaties, alliances, and warfare. In West Africa, commercial interests around the Niger helped lead toward colonial Nigeria. In East Africa, Britain expanded into territories that became Kenya and Uganda. Control of the Nile became strategically important because Egypt and Suez linked Britain to India. Britain occupied Egypt in 1882 after defeating the nationalist movement led by Ahmed Urabi. Egypt remained formally connected to the Ottoman Empire for a time, but British influence became dominant. In Sudan, the Mahdiist uprising destroyed an Anglo-Egyptian force and captured Khartoum in 1885, killing General Charles Gordon. Britain returned more than a decade later. At Omdurman in 1898, forces under Herbert Kitchener used modern rifles, artillery, and machine guns with devastating effect. Industrial military technology had created an enormous imbalance. Southern Africa became another center of expansion. Diamonds were discovered near Kimberley. Gold was found on the Witwatersrand. Cecil Rhodes accumulated an enormous diamond fortune and pursued dreams of British expansion. His British South Africa Company extended control into territories later called Rhodesia. African societies resisted. The British fought the Zulu Kingdom in 1879. At Isandlwana, Zulu forces destroyed a large British column, proving that imperial troops were far from invincible. Britain ultimately brought overwhelming resources into the conflict and defeated the Zulu Kingdom. But resistance never disappeared simply because Europeans colored territory on a map. Then Britain's ambitions collided with the Boer republics. The Second Boer War began in 1899. Britain expected a relatively manageable conflict. Instead, Boer forces inflicted severe reverses and later turned to guerrilla warfare. Britain responded by destroying farms and confining civilians in concentration camps. Poor conditions and disease killed tens of thousands of Boer civilians, mostly women and children. Black Africans were also confined in separate camps and suffered thousands of deaths. Britain eventually won in 1902. The victory demonstrated imperial strength. The difficulty of achieving it revealed imperial vulnerability. In 1910, the Union of South Africa became a self-governing dominion. Political reconciliation between white British and Afrikaner populations largely excluded the black African majority. The foundations of later institutionalized racial segregation were being strengthened. At the same time, organized Indian nationalism was growing. The Indian National Congress was founded in 1885. Its early leaders generally demanded reform rather than immediate independence. They wanted greater Indian participation in administration and political institutions. They often used the very principles Britain claimed to represent: law, representation, political accountability, equality. This produced an increasingly uncomfortable question. If British liberty was genuinely universal, why were Indians denied equal political power? If it was not universal, what did imperial talk of civilization and freedom actually mean? Victorian Britain often avoided the question through confidence. Queen Victoria became Empress of India. Her jubilees celebrated an empire stretching around the planet. London stood at the center of global finance. British merchant shipping carried immense quantities of world trade. Undersea cables connected continents. Steamships traveled routes supported by imperial ports and coaling stations. To many contemporaries, the empire seemed permanent. Yet its greatest test was approaching. When Britain declared war on Germany on August 4th, 1914, the empire entered the First World War with it. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Newfoundland, South Africa, India, African colonies, Caribbean territories, and others supplied soldiers, workers, money, food, and materials. More than 1 million Indian soldiers and laborers served overseas, with broader estimates of wartime participation running higher. Indian troops fought in France, the Middle East, and Africa. Canadians fought at Ypres, the Somme, Passchendaele, and Vimy Ridge. Australian and New Zealand troops became famous through the disastrous Gallipoli campaign. African carriers sustained campaigns that could not have operated without them, suffering immense casualties from disease, hunger, and exhaustion. Colonial troops were fighting in a war constantly described in the language of freedom. That language would have consequences. In the Middle East, Britain fought the Ottoman Empire while making overlapping diplomatic commitments. It supported an Arab revolt against Ottoman rule. Britain and France secretly discussed future spheres of influence through the Sykes-Picot Agreement. In 1917, the Balfour Declaration expressed British support for a Jewish national home in Palestine, while stating that the rights of existing non-Jewish communities should not be prejudiced. The attempt to pursue different wartime objectives created expectations that later proved extremely difficult to reconcile. Britain won the war. It also emerged financially weakened. Millions had died across the conflict. Britain owed enormous sums. The United States had become more powerful, and the Dominions had acquired confidence through their wartime sacrifices. After 1918, Britain's empire actually became larger. League of Nations mandates gave Britain authority over former German and Ottoman territories, including Iraq, Palestine, and Tanganyika. The empire reached its maximum territorial extent, yet maximum size concealed declining cohesion. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa increasingly demanded equality rather than subordination. Ireland fought its War of Independence beginning in 1919. The Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921 created the Irish Free State across most of the island, while Northern Ireland remained within the United Kingdom. Britain was already retreating from one of its oldest territorial relationships. India became even more consequential. Indians who had expected major political concessions after wartime service instead encountered limited constitutional reform alongside repressive legislation. In April 1919, British troops under Brigadier General Reginald Dyer fired into a crowd at Jallianwala Bagh in Amritsar. Official British figures recorded 379 deaths, while Indian estimates were higher. The massacre shattered confidence in British rule among many Indians. Mahatma Gandhi emerged as the central leader of mass nationalist politics. Through non-cooperation and civil disobedience, Gandhi attacked imperial authority without trying to defeat Britain conventionally on a battlefield. His method targeted the foundation upon which empire depended: cooperation. Britain had relatively few British officials governing hundreds of millions of Indians. It depended on Indian civil servants, police, soldiers, merchants, workers, and political intermediaries. If enough Indians withdrew their participation, ruling became much harder. In 1930, Gandhi selected the salt tax as a symbol. He marched to the sea and made salt in defiance of colonial law. The act was simple enough for anyone to understand. Why should a foreign government control something as basic as salt? Civil disobedience spread. Thousands were imprisoned. International attention followed. Britain offered reforms, but resisted immediate independence. The Government of India Act of 1935 expanded provincial self-government. Elections brought Indian politicians into government. Yet another problem was deepening. Muhammad Ali Jinnah and the Muslim League increasingly argued that India's Muslims needed strong constitutional protection and ultimately advanced the demand for Pakistan. The approaching end of British rule threatened to produce a struggle over who would inherit power. Then the Second World War began. Britain declared war on Nazi Germany in September 1939. The Dominions now possessed substantial constitutional autonomy and made their own decisions regarding participation. India did not. The Viceroy declared India at war without consulting elected Indian leaders. That demonstrated precisely how limited Indian self-government remained. In 1940, France fell. Britain faced Germany largely alone in Western Europe. The Empire and Commonwealth became essential. Canadian industry supplied the war effort. Australian, New Zealand, South African, Indian, African, and Caribbean personnel served across multiple theaters. Britain survived the Battle of Britain and continued fighting. Then Japan entered the war in December 1941. Its victories delivered a devastating blow to European imperial prestige. Hong Kong fell. Japanese forces advanced through Malaya. On February 15, 1942, Singapore surrendered. Tens of thousands of British, Indian, Australian, and other troops became prisoners. For generations, colonial rule in Asia had rested partly on assumptions of European military superiority. Japan shattered that image in weeks. Japanese occupation was itself frequently violent and oppressive. But Britain could never fully reconstruct the old aura of invincibility. Burma fell. Japan approached India. Meanwhile, Indian nationalism intensified. The Congress demanded independence. In 1942, Gandhi launched the Quit India movement. Britain arrested Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, and much of the Congress leadership. Protests spread. The government suppressed them. Subhash Chandra Bose pursued a different strategy, seeking Axis assistance and becoming associated with the Indian National Army fighting alongside Japan. Most Indian military personnel remained on the Allied side. By the end of the war, the British Indian Army had grown to more than 2 million volunteers. Indian soldiers were crucial to the campaigns that stopped Japan at Impol and Kohima and later drove Japanese forces back through Burma. The contradiction could hardly have been greater. India supplied one of the largest volunteer armies in history to Britain's war effort, while Britain refused immediate Indian independence. Then famine devastated Bengal in 1943. An estimated 2 to 3 million people died. The causes included wartime inflation and disruption, loss of rice imports from Burma, crop problems, market failures, and government policies. Historians continue debating the precise responsibility of Churchill's government and other authorities. What is not disputed is that the official response failed disastrously during crucial stages. Mass starvation under a government claiming responsibility for India's welfare further damaged Britain's legitimacy. The war itself changed the global balance completely. Britain survived and won, but at tremendous economic cost. The United States and Soviet Union emerged as superpowers. Britain was heavily indebted and needed to rebuild its cities, industries, housing, and social institutions. Maintaining a worldwide empire against determined nationalist movements now looked enormously expensive. In 1945, Clement Attlee's Labour Party defeated Churchill's Conservatives. India's future immediately became urgent. Congress demanded independence. The Muslim League demanded safeguards that increasingly centered on a separate Pakistan. Britain attempted a final compromise through the Cabinet Mission of 1946. It failed. Communal violence escalated horrifically. Britain announced that its rule would end. Lord Mountbatten, the final viceroy, accelerated the timetable. The subcontinent would be partitioned. Pakistan became independent on August 14, 1947. India followed on August 15th. British rule over the heart of South Asia was finished. Independence was accompanied by catastrophe. Approximately 10 to 15 million people crossed the new borders. Muslims moved toward Pakistan. Hindus and Sikhs moved toward India. Massacres occurred. Trains arrived filled with bodies. Women were abducted and subjected to terrible violence. Estimates of deaths range from several hundred thousand toward 1 million or more. Political organizations, communal militias, collapsing authority, revenge, fear, and the extraordinary speed of partition all contributed. Britain had ruled India for generations partly by claiming it provided stability. It departed amid one of the greatest forced migrations in modern history. Kashmir quickly became another unresolved crisis. India and Pakistan fought their first war over the territory. The dispute survived British withdrawal and remains dangerous today. India's independence transformed the future of the entire empire. Britain had survived, losing America. Losing India was different. India had become central to imperial strategy, manpower, prestige, and economic relationships. Once hundreds of millions of Indians governed themselves, permanent European control elsewhere looked far less secure. Burma became independent in 1948. Ceylon, later Sri Lanka, gained independence the same year. Across Asia and Africa, nationalist leaders watched closely. In Malaya, Britain fought a communist-led insurgency during the Malayan Emergency, while simultaneously preparing a constitutional transfer of power. The Federation of Malaya became independent in 1957. Military success had not preserved colonial rule. It had helped create conditions for a different political settlement. In Palestine, Britain faced another crisis rooted partly in commitments dating from the First World War. Jewish immigration had increased, especially as persecution in Europe intensified. Palestinian Arab opposition to Zionism and British policy produced serious conflict. After the Holocaust, pressure for a Jewish state became even stronger. Jewish underground organizations fought British authority. Britain finally referred the problem to the United Nations. The UN proposed partition in 1947. Britain ended its mandate in May 1948. Israel declared independence. War followed. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians fled or were expelled in the events Palestinians remember as the Nakba. Britain departed, but the consequences of the mandate and the larger Arab-Israeli conflict remained. Then came the crisis that publicly exposed Britain's diminished global power. Egypt had formally gained independence earlier, but Britain retained a military presence around the Suez Canal. Gamal Abdel Nasser regarded foreign control over the canal as incompatible with Egyptian sovereignty. In July 1956, he nationalized the Suez Canal Company. Britain and France secretly coordinated with Israel on a military operation. Israel invaded Egypt. Britain and France intervened. Militarily, they could still project power. Politically, the plan collapsed. The United States opposed the operation. International pressure mounted. Sterling came under severe financial strain. Britain withdrew. Nasser survived. Suez demonstrated that Britain could no longer act as a 19th century imperial power against the wishes of the United States and expect to dictate the result. Britain remained influential. It possessed nuclear weapons, a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council, major armed forces, global finance, and extensive diplomatic connections. But the hierarchy of world power had changed. The United States and Soviet Union dominated the new international system. Meanwhile, nationalism was sweeping Africa. The Gold Coast, led toward independence by Kwame Nkrumah, became Ghana in 1957. Its independence had enormous symbolic force. Nkrumah argued that Ghana's freedom mattered only as part of the liberation of Africa. Nigeria became independent in 1960. Sierra Leone followed in 1961. Tanganyika became independent in 1961 and later joined Zanzibar to form Tanzania. Uganda became independent in 1962. Kenya followed in 1963. Malawi and Zambia emerged in 1964. The Gambia became independent in 1965. Botswana and Lesotho in 1966. Swaziland, now Eswatini, in 1968. These transfers did not all occur peacefully. Kenya experienced the violent Mau emergency. The conflict was rooted heavily in land dispossession, political exclusion, and colonial inequality. Britain detained large numbers of people and reorganized rural populations. Detainees experienced serious abuses, including torture and violent mistreatment. Mau fighters also killed opponents and civilians. The insurgency was militarily defeated, but the political system that produced it did not survive. Kenya gained independence under Jomo Kenyatta in 1963. Decades later, Britain reached a legal settlement with thousands of Kenyan claimants who had suffered abuse during the emergency and formally expressed regret for torture and ill treatment by the colonial administration. Southern Africa proved more difficult. South Africa had long possessed self-government and became a republic outside the Commonwealth in 1961 after the white minority government entrenched apartheid. Apartheid was implemented by South Africans rather than a contemporary British colonial administration, but its development occurred within a longer history of Dutch and British settlement, conquest, racial exclusion, and land dispossession. In southern Rhodesia, white minority leader Ian Smith declared independence from Britain unilaterally in 1965 rather than accept an immediate transition toward majority rule. Britain refused to recognize the regime. Years of sanctions, guerrilla warfare, and negotiations followed. In 1980, the territory achieved recognized independence as Zimbabwe. In the Caribbean, Britain experimented with the West Indies Federation, but it collapsed. Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago became independent in 1962. Barbados followed in 1966. Other Caribbean colonies became independent later, while some chose to remain British territories. Decolonization was reshaping Britain at home too. For centuries, British settlers, soldiers, merchants and officials had traveled outward. Now migration increasingly moved in the opposite direction. The arrival of the Empire Windrush from the Caribbean in 1948 became a famous symbol of post-war migration, though black communities had existed in Britain long before it. Migrants from the Caribbean, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Africa, and elsewhere filled labor shortages and built lives in Britain. Many arrived as British subjects from an empire or commonwealth they had been taught they belonged to. They often encountered racism and discrimination. Yet their presence permanently transformed British society. Food, music, religion, literature, language, sport, and politics all changed. Empire had come home. The Commonwealth evolved as well. In 1949, India became a republic while remaining a member. This required a new understanding of the organization. Member states no longer needed to recognize the British monarch as their sovereign. The Commonwealth increasingly became a voluntary association of independent countries rather than an instrument of British government. Former colonies could disagree openly with London. They could pursue independent foreign policies. They could leave. Empire and Commonwealth were no longer interchangeable. By the 1960s, British leaders openly recognized the speed of change. Prime Minister Harold Macmillan's 1960 Wind of Change speech acknowledged the force of African nationalism. Britain had not created that nationalism. Africans had built their movements themselves. What had changed was London's calculation. Trying to hold large territories permanently against organized political opposition was increasingly unrealistic. The empire, therefore, did not end through one dramatic collapse. Some colonies won independence after violent struggle. Others achieved it through prolonged negotiations. Some transitions were relatively peaceful. Others left borders and political systems under enormous stress. Britain often attempted to preserve economic, military, and diplomatic influence after surrendering formal sovereignty. The Union Jack disappeared while companies, banks, military agreements, educational ties, and legal institutions remained. By the 1970s, the enormous territorial empire was clearly gone. But one highly symbolic colony remained. Hong Kong had been acquired in stages during Britain's 19th century conflicts with China. Hong Kong Island was ceded after the First Opium War. Kowloon Territory followed. The new territories were leased in 1898 for 99 years. By the late 20th century, the territories were economically and geographically inseparable. The lease would expire in 1997. The People's Republic of China insisted upon recovering sovereignty over the whole colony. Britain could not realistically retain Hong Kong against China's opposition. Negotiations produced the 1984 Sino-British Joint Declaration. Britain agreed to transfer Hong Kong to China in 1997 under arrangements associated with the principle of one country, two systems. Before that handover, Britain fought one final major war over an overseas territory. In 1982, Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands, whose sovereignty Argentina disputed and continues to dispute. Britain dispatched a naval task force to the South Atlantic. After intense fighting, Argentine forces surrendered. The war demonstrated that Britain retained significant expeditionary military power, but it did not restore the global empire. The Falklands remained one of a relatively small number of overseas territories whose inhabitants today have their own political relationship with Britain. Then, at midnight on July 1st, 1997, sovereignty over Hong Kong passed to China. The Union Jack came down. The Chinese flag rose. More than 150 years of British administration ended. For many observers, this became the symbolic sunset of the British Empire. Britain still retains overseas territories, including Bermuda, Gibraltar, the Falkland Islands, the Cayman Islands, the British Virgin Islands, and others. Their modern circumstances differ substantially from those of the old mass empire, and several populations have clearly expressed a desire to retain their connection with Britain. But the era when London governed hundreds of millions of colonial subjects was finished. What remained was the argument over what the empire had actually done. That argument continues because the historical record contains achievements and injustices that cannot accurately be reduced to a single slogan. Britain constructed railways, ports, legal institutions, schools, bureaucracies, and communication systems across large parts of its empire. Many survived independence and were adapted by the nations that inherited them. But this infrastructure was not simply an altruistic gift. Railways moved passengers and local goods, but they also moved troops and export commodities. Telegraphs connected cities while allowing imperial governments to exercise tighter control. Ports encouraged commerce while frequently orienting colonial economies toward imperial markets. Schools created educated populations, some of whose members later became the empire's strongest opponents. The effects could therefore be useful and exploitative simultaneously. The history of slavery contains an equally important contradiction. Britain became a major international force against the Atlantic slave trade during the 19th century. The Royal Navy devoted decades to suppressing it. British abolitionists helped create one of history's most influential humanitarian movements. Yet Britain had previously been one of the leading Atlantic slave, trading, and plantation powers. British fortunes had been built from enslaved labor. When slavery was abolished, owners received compensation while formerly enslaved people did not. The history cannot begin conveniently in 1807, nor should it end before abolition. Both belong to the same story. India presents similar complexity. British rule expanded railways, centralized institutions, universities, communications, and participation in global trade. It also existed because Britain possessed ultimate coercive authority over Indians who lacked sovereignty over their own country. Revenues supported imperial priorities. Economic policies transformed Indian industries. Racial inequality persisted. Famines revealed severe failures of colonial governance. And independence required generations of Indian political struggle. To recognize one side while erasing the other turns history into propaganda. The empire's economic impact is equally difficult to summarize in one calculation. Many Britons and British institutions profited enormously from imperial trade, plantations, mining, Indian revenues, shipping, banking, and overseas investment. At other times, particular colonies cost the British government significant amounts to administer and defend. Not every British citizen benefited equally. Not every colony experienced the same economic outcome. Within colonized societies, some merchants and political elites prospered through imperial networks, while other communities lost land, autonomy, industries, or livelihoods. Empire created winners and losers on both sides of the ocean. Its political borders also survived. European colonial governments drew, negotiated, or formalized boundaries across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Some cut through older political and cultural relationships. It would be too simplistic to blame every later conflict solely on colonial mapmakers. Independent states and leaders possess their own agency. But colonial borders and institutions undeniably formed part of the conditions inherited by later generations. The empire disappeared. Its geography did not. Neither did its language. English spread across the world partly through British expansion and later through American economic and cultural influence. Former colonies transformed the language into their own. Indian English is not merely borrowed British English. Neither a Nigerian, Caribbean, Singaporean, Australian, Canadian, or countless other forms. The language escaped the ownership of the country that had helped spread it. So did British sports. Cricket traveled through imperial institutions and was transformed into a passion across India, Pakistan, the Caribbean, Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, Sri Lanka, and elsewhere. Former colonies could beat Britain at a game Britain had carried abroad. Institutions biavaient similarly. Parliamentary systems were copied, modified, abandoned, and rebuilt. Common law traditions developed local forms. Christian missionary movements created churches that eventually became larger outside Britain than within it. Imperial culture moved outward and returned transformed. Modern Britain itself cannot be understood without that return. Its cities contain communities connected historically to nearly every region the empire touched. Its museums contain objects acquired during exploration, commerce, diplomacy, archaeology, and conquest. Its architecture carries wealth generated overseas. Its cuisine reflects migration. Its political debates over citizenship and race developed partly from imperial history. Families across Britain and its former colonies remain connected by generations of movement in both directions. The empire, therefore, did not simply happen somewhere overseas. It helped create modern Britain, and the reason it disappeared can ultimately be understood through several enormous changes. Nationalism transformed colonial politics. People increasingly organized around the belief that they possessed the right to govern themselves. 2 world wars weakened Britain's finances while mobilizing colonial populations. Industrial power spread to competitors. The United States and Soviet Union replaced the European empires as the dominant global powers after 1945. International political language increasingly favored national sovereignty. The economic and military price of suppressing independence movements rose. And Britain's own governments often concluded that influence through trade, diplomacy, alliances, and the Commonwealth was preferable to endless colonial warfare. But beneath all those explanations was one deeper problem. An empire can govern without universal consent for a very long time. It cannot make the question of consent disappear forever. Britain's navy could defeat rival fleets. Its armies could occupy cities. Its companies could control trade. Its administrators could collect taxes. Its telegraphs could transmit orders. Its railways could move soldiers. Its police could arrest nationalist leaders. But none of these could permanently answer a question that became louder throughout the 20th century. Why should one country possess the right to rule another people? The empire had offered different answers at different moments. Religion, commerce, civilization, strategic necessity, law, development, protection, order. But the people being governed increasingly rejected the premise itself. Once that happened, military superiority could delay independence. It could not permanently prevent it. And so the British Empire did not experience one final fall comparable to an ancient capital being conquered. It ended piece by piece. The United States departed in 1783. Most of Ireland left British rule in the early 20th century. India and Pakistan became independent in 1947. Burma and Ceylon followed. Ghana, Malaya, Nigeria, Jamaica, Kenya, Zambia, dozens of others. Zimbabwe, after its complicated struggle. Hong Kong in 1997. Each departure had its own history. Together, they transformed the political map of the world. This gradual ending reveals something important about the empire's beginning as well. There had never been a single moment when England created a master plan and decided to conquer a quarter of the earth. John Cabot wanted a route. Virginia investors wanted profit. Caribbean planners wanted labor. The East India Company wanted Asian trade. Parliament wanted customs revenue. Naval commanders wanted strategic bases. Settlers wanted land. Industrialists wanted markets. Missionaries wanted converts. Politicians wanted prestige and security. Each generation inherited opportunities and problems created by the previous one. A trading post needed protection. Protection produced a fort. A fort required soldiers. Soldiers became involved in local politics. A military victory created territory. Territory required administration. Administration required revenue. Revenue created resistance. Resistance produced further intervention. Expansion often created the argument for more expansion. That is how a collection of ventures became an imperial system. And decline worked similarly. A colony demanded representation. Representation created expectations. A dominion gained autonomy. Other peoples demanded the same principle. A war weakened the treasury. A rebellion demonstrated the cost of control. One successful independence movement inspired another. A global crisis exposed the limits of British power. Slowly, the structure changed until what remained could no longer meaningfully be called the empire that Victoria had known. The British Empire lasted so long partly because it was flexible. It governed Canada differently from India, India differently from Nigeria, Nigeria differently from Hong Kong. Some territories were colonies. Some were protectorates. Some were mandates. Some were princely states under paramountcy. Some became self-governing dominions. Sometimes companies exercised power. Sometimes governors did. Sometimes Britain ruled directly. Sometimes it controlled foreign policy while local rulers remained. There was never one uniform imperial constitution. That flexibility allowed the system to survive crises that might have destroyed a more rigid empire. But eventually flexibility transformed the empire beyond recognition. Dominions became sovereign. Colonies became nations. Subjects became citizens. The Commonwealth replaced imperial hierarchy with voluntary association. London retained influence but lost command. And that difference is everything. Today, the legacy remains in places where people do not always recognize it. In railway lines, in borders, in parliamentary chambers, in court systems, in street names, in military regiments, in museums, in multinational companies, in universities, in family histories, in migration patterns, in English words spoken thousands of miles from England, in disputes over artifacts, in demands for reparations, in arguments about national identity, in the Commonwealth. in Britain's remaining overseas territories, and in the political problems inherited from a world whose boundaries were often created when imperial officials believed their decisions might last forever. The empire itself did not last forever. No empire does. At its height, Britain's geographical reach was so enormous that daylight always touched some territory under British authority. That gave rise to the boast that the sun never set on the British Empire. Yet geography alone does not explain either the empire's strength or its disappearance. Its true power came from connections. Ships connected ports. Credit connected investors to governments. The slave trade connected African captivity with American plantations and European consumption. India connected taxation with military power. Railways connected inland production to coastal markets. Telegraphs connected governors with London. Industrial factories connected British workers to raw materials produced across oceans. World wars connected colonial soldiers to distant battlefields. Migration eventually connected former colonies back to Britain itself. Those connections survived longer than imperial sovereignty, and that may be the most important legacy of all. Britain no longer governs India, but Britain and India remain deeply connected. Britain no longer governs Jamaica, but Jamaican culture helped transform Britain. Britain no longer rules Nigeria, but millions of personal, educational, commercial, and cultural connections link the two countries. Australia and Canada evolved from colonies into sovereign states while retaining historical and constitutional connections. The empire disappeared as a political hierarchy while the network it created fragmented, changed direction, and continued. This is why its history cannot be reduced simply to a story of British greatness, nor can it be understood simply as a catalog of British crimes. It was a structure of power populated by human beings with conflicting interests. There were explorers motivated by curiosity, merchants motivated by profit, officials who believed they were improving societies, officials who abused authority, settlers searching for opportunity, indigenous peoples defending land, enslaved people fighting for freedom, soldiers serving an empire that did not treat all of them equally, nationalists learning the political language of liberty and turning it against imperial rule. Some people collaborated with Britain because doing so served their interests. Others resisted from the beginning. Many did, both at different points in their lives. History becomes more understandable when those people are restored to the story. The empire was not merely something Britain did to an empty map. The people Britain encountered shaped the empire too. Indian alliances made company conquest possible before Indian nationalism helped make the Raj impossible. African intermediaries participated in trade while African resistance repeatedly challenged conquest. Dominion politicians transformed colonies into autonomous states. Caribbean enslaved people and abolitionists helped destroy slavery. Colonial soldiers helped Britain survive 2 world wars and return to societies where demands for equality became increasingly difficult to reject. The empire shaped its subjects. Its subjects also shaped the empire's fate. And in the end, the system contained a contradiction it could never fully resolve. Britain celebrated parliamentary government while ruling millions without representation. It celebrated liberty while participating in slavery. It fought wars against tyranny while maintaining colonies. It promoted free trade and sometimes open markets by military force. It claimed to respect law while law itself encoded racial inequality in parts of its empire. It educated colonial subjects in political ideals that helped them dismantle colonial rule. Those contradictions did not destroy the empire immediately. For centuries, military and economic power could contain them. The 20th century made containment harder, then impossible. The final transformation was therefore not simply Britain's decline. It was the rise of other peoples as sovereign political actors. India was not merely a British possession that Britain lost. It became an independent country because Indians built political movements powerful enough to make continued foreign rule untenable. Ghana was not simply abandoned. Ghanaian nationalists demanded government in their own name. The same principle repeated differently across the imperial world. The end of empire was not empty space left behind by departing British administrators. It was occupied immediately by nations already waiting to speak for themselves. That is where the story that began with John Cabot finally reaches its conclusion. A small kingdom once looked outward because stronger powers already dominated the great routes of global commerce. It learned to sail farther. It built companies. It established colonies. It accumulated naval bases. It mastered systems of credit capable of financing enormous wars. It participated deeply in slavery and plantation economies. It defeated major European rivals. It conquered territories and created alliances across India. It industrialized before its competitors. It used steamships, railways, telegraphs, and naval power to connect possessions around the earth. It survived losing America. It defeated Napoleon. It expanded across Africa. It reached its greatest territorial extent only after the First World War. Then the same global system that had amplified British power began amplifying the demands of those it governed. Education created political leaders. Communication connected nationalists. War produced veterans. Representative institutions created expectations. Economic development produced new social classes. The rhetoric of British liberty supplied opponents with arguments Britain could not easily answer. The machinery of empire helped create the conditions for a world beyond empire. And so there was no final emperor, no single surrender, no final invading army capturing London. Instead, there were negotiations, elections, strikes, rebellions, mass movements, wars, conferences, parliamentary acts, independence ceremonies, flags lowered in one capital after another. Sometimes the transition was peaceful. Sometimes it was catastrophic. Sometimes Britain left behind stable governments. Sometimes the structures inherited by new nations carried profound tensions. But each transfer made the old imperial world less recoverable. Eventually, the famous red map became history. The United Kingdom remained. The former colonies remained. The relationships remained. The memories remained. But sovereignty had moved. And after 5 centuries of merchants and monarchs, companies and plantations, ships and armies, conquest and resistance, the central fact that it sustained the British Empire was finally reversed. London no longer decided the political future of hundreds of millions of people scattered across the world. They decided it themselves. The empire on which the sun was said never to set had reached its sunset, not because its history vanished, but because the peoples living beneath that sun had become nations in their own right.